Hello everybody, it is I, Justice Samuel Alito. Actually, no, this is like too disrespectful. Gonna make a little outcrop there. Do you love it? Sorry, I could not disservice the bald community by appointing Justice Combe-Over to our ranks. Hi, I'm Justice Samuel Alito. Welcome, my children. I've been getting a lot of questions about the Supreme Court lately. For example, why are you doing this to me? What's wrong with you? Why can't you just f***ing die already, you piece of shit? I get that one a lot, actually. The amount of public scrutiny that the Supreme Court is getting is actually pretty unusual.
My fellow bimbos, I write to you from my office in Boob Palace at this time of constitutional crisis in our beautiful republic of Bimbo Land.
The court has been the center of controversy in the past. An obvious example is Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional. Whoops. An equally obvious and more flattering example is Brown v. Board of Education, when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. Isn't it interesting how much of the Supreme Court's major rulings are just unf***ing mistakes that the court itself made in the past? But even during the most intense periods of civic unrest in the past, the court enjoyed kind of a apolitical transcendence. It all kind of goes back to the separation of powers in the Constitution. The legislative branch, Congress, and the executive branch, the president, those dung beetles can fight away in their slurry of political speech, while the court would kind of float above it as a transcendent governing daddy who could just dispense logic and reason free of any kind of political rumbling. The court's job is, after all, law, not politics. Politicians push society in a direction based on their desired end goal, whereas justices push society in a certain direction based on the writings of 18th century slaveholders, which I can't think of anything more apolitical than that. But the court's latest decision, where we reversed Roe versus Wade, marked kind of what looks to be a sea change in terms of the public's perception of the court. One of the most significant changes from past controversies surrounding the Supreme Court is that although the protests now are focused around the right to abortion, the main grievance isn't really fundamentally the decision to reverse Roe versus Wade. It's that a fundamentalist far-right scheme has rendered the court's authority to make any decision illegitimate. The big-brain, skeptic, centrist among you might say, Justice Alito, you f***ing monster. That sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory. Are you telling me that the lefties who were just making fun of the QAnon crowd are suddenly telling me that there's some kind of like right-wing cabal that it's appointing Supreme Court justices? That sounds a little fake. And yet the Christian nationalist judicial coup is very much real.
The Bimbo Land Constitution was stolen!
In this video, we're going to look at the organization that's primarily responsible for overtaking the Supreme Court. We'll figure out how they did it, and we're going to assess how bad the damage really is. Unfortunately, if this video was talking about all the ways that the Supreme Court ruined everyone's lives in the last month, it would be like 10 hours long. So I'm going to focus on what I believe the right's next legal cause is going to be. Christian public schools. I think that a lot of you are probably going to be surprised at how close we are to the utter destruction of the separation between church and school. Before we go over how schools are soon going to be teaching how, I don't know, evolution is actually a scheme to groom kids to become drag queens or, I don't know, whatever. What we're going to need to do, you and I, is go over kind of the basic fundamental structure of the federal courts and how the far right has gamed the system to codify a Christian nationalist worldview into the law. So I'm going to start by being fair. If there's one thing that I, Samuel Alito, is known for, it's fairness. And also my saggy and unnerving face. I went and visited my alma mater and they thought I was an evil beanbag made of leather. So in all fairness, there is kind of a good reason why we have the Supreme Court. We do sort of need one official interpretation of the Constitution.
What are our basic rights as bimbos? How should they be interpreted?
The Constitution is a guidebook to who gets power to do what in the US of A. As anyone who's spent any time in any kind of internet fandom knows, if you're willing to torture the text of a story enough, it will admit to anything. Meaning that textual interpretation is very subjective and it's very arbitrary. If we leave it up to politicians to police the limits to their own power based off of their interpretation of the Constitution, they'll be able to find constitutional support for anything. That would be a unmanageable and very chaotic form of government. That's why everyone's kind of accepted that the Supreme Court gets to be the one official source of constitutional interpretation in the United States. The controversy sort of starts with the fact that the Constitution was written several hundred years ago, and it was amended 27 times. So there's not really a clear and unambiguous way to apply the old Constitution to pretty much any modern legal problem. I mean, we're litigating things that the Founding Fathers couldn't have envisioned in their wildest opium-induced hazes. Because the Supreme Court has supreme authority to interpret the Constitution, what they say the Constitution says matters a lot more than what the Constitution actually says. A Supreme Court justice could interpret the Constitution in bad faith, and there'd be kind of nothing to stop them. For example, if the Constitution says that every citizen has the right to suck dick and but the Supreme Court says that nobody can suck dick and then you're not going to be sucking dick and Nancy Reagan would be devastated. In addition to the enormous power of interpretation, the Supreme Court also has the power to choose what cases it rules on. The chances of any single case making it to the Supreme Court are exceedingly slim. About 10,000 cases petition to be heard by the Supreme Court every year, and of that number, the Supreme Court hears about 70. And of the cases that qualify to be heard by the Supreme Court, there isn't a protocol that says that they're obligated to hear cases that have certain qualities. It's pretty arbitrary. So given that the only criteria for a qualifying case to be heard by the court is whether or not enough justices want to hear it, most conservative justices pick cases along ideological lines, particularly if they've had a certain axe to grind, or should I say axe to abort. So how does any lawyer get their hand on that kind of rock-hard, throbbing legal authority? Well, they get nominated by the president and then appointed by Congress. That's technically all there is to it. Although the word technically is doing kind of a lot of legwork there. Like to become one of those deep-sea divers that work like 2,000 feet below the surface of the ocean on oil rigs, all you technically need to do is get licensed and then hired. But in reality, you have to get a ton of recreational and then commercial diving experience, and also get over the innate human fear of the depths below, which are pitch black and almost completely unexplored, and as far as we know, could be the home to like a primordial jellyfish that's the size of a house. What I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of steps that implicitly come before the first step here. In the case of Supreme Court justices, you have to go to one of the top law schools, and no offense, by that I mean like one of the 3 top law schools. Sorry, University of Michigan. After you get into Yale or Harvard, you have to cozy up to the right people, people who have the ear of the president, and then you have to convince those people to convince the president to appoint you. In a nutshell, it's all about who you know. Which is why so many Supreme Court justices have been essentially groomed since their youths to become justices. Take, for example, Junior Associate Justice and Senior Daddy Neil Gorsuch, whose mom was the head of the EPA under Reagan. Sorry about all that climate change, kids. He's like, my mom would have never caused climate change to advance because then we wouldn't be able to go skiing in our chalet in Aspen.
The world suffered a seismic shock with the loss of Justice Scalia. A few weeks ago, I was taking a breather in the middle of a ski run.
What's that? There's been a seismic shock?
With little on my mind but the next mogul field before me when the phone rang with the news. I immediately lost what breath I had left.
Scalia!
Likewise, Brett Kavanaugh, who probably thinks that EPA stands for eating an ass, he was funneled through Washington, D.C.'s high-powered factories, aka prestigious boys' Catholic schools, since he was a kid. Even Clarence Thomas, who had relatively humble beginnings, was fast-tracked to the seat of power thanks to all the connections he made at Yale as a result of his hardline conservative views. Which is why he thinks that EPA stands for even perverts ascend. If you're thinking, oof, that sounds like an aristocracy of prestige, and it would probably be very easy for fascists to use that to kind of bypass democracy and attaining total power, yeah, you're not alone. Fascists were thinking that too, except they were thinking it in like a horny kind of way.
This has saddened me and meant that democracy in Bimbo Land has regressed.
Speaking of fascists, I think that we need to take a minute to talk about the Christian right. Well, hello, it's me, Phyllis Schlafly, vanquisher of women's libers, defeater of the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm gonna be honest, this costume isn't really turning out how I wanted. My gown is sort of giving me like Barbara Bush boudoir, and this makeup is looking a lot more like if Bette Davis's character in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was like an abusive high school counselor. But I'm not here to read myself, I'm here to read the Constitution. And, you know, it is the evening, and I think we should have a little bit of a calmer lighting, you know, to commemorate the cicada of the hour. So, give me just 1 second. Down to... By the way, no, I cannot do anything about the cicadas. Oh, you know who I look like? I look like Sandra Day O'Connor a little bit. But no, I am Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly. Religious fundamentalism has always been a thing in the United States. I think it's kind of a thing everywhere. However, with the exception of the Puritans, it hasn't held a lot of mainstream political sway until very recently. Around the 1980s, evangelicals, who prior to that had been characterized mostly by like somewhat fragmented micro niches and sects, they became political. The story among evangelicals is that they were minding their own business, working 90-hour weeks as farmer businessmen with a wife and 6 kids in the Midwestern South, when all of a sudden the activist Supreme Court handed down Roe versus Wade, and they just had to jump into politics as if on outrage-fueled jetpacks. In truth, after Roe, for several years, most evangelical churches were in favor of abortion. You see, scumbag fundamentalist overlords like Billy Graham, Paul Weyrich, Jerry Falwell, and Phyllis Schlafly. They were all mad because the IRS was forcing private religious schools to desegregate. If you want to learn more about that, I do have a video about QAnon. Anyway, despite how cynical this brazen manipulation of Christian moral values was, it was pretty successful. Not only were fundamentalist leaders able to fabricate genuine moral outrage over abortion, but they were able to use that as a catalyst to get involved with all sorts of culture war politics. In fact, in 1980, evangelicals were pretty significantly responsible for getting Reagan elected, so thanks for that. So by the 1990s, the Christian right was fighting the culture war on kind of every front. One of the hottest hot-button issues was bringing religion back into public schools. I'm using scare quotes around back because, one thing, I have a scary back, but also the idea that religion was ever significantly a part of public schools in the first place is sort of not true. Prayer in public schools, by and large, stopped being a thing kind of in the 1800s, following significant religious conflict. The Supreme Court got involved in this for the first time following World War II in the 1940s, and pretty much immediately set up a strict divide between church and school. The question of whether or not religious public schools are constitutional is centered around the First Amendment.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
That might seem like pretty clear, but as we mentioned in the daytime portion of this video, what the Constitution says matters a lot less than what the court says that the Constitution says. So a lot of the free speech rulings from before World War II were kind of terrible. Basically, they amounted to commie v. gun, with the court siding with the gun.
Bimbos should own the means of production.
In 1947's Everson v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that school boards could not use public school funding to transport students to private Catholic schools. Okay, but hold on for a second. You might be thinking, wait, so if you can't have religion in schools, what's the deal with private Catholic schools? And that is a great question. That's really smart. I think your intelligence is one of the things I like most about you, not in your strong arms. The Constitution applies to the government, and public schools are part of the government. Private schools are not, and as long as they don't receive direct public funding, they have way more leeway. So private religious schools can't do things like racially discriminate, but they can do things like only admit a single gender, practice religion, and kick students out for being gay. Throughout the 60s and 70s, the court cemented and refined its strict stance that the correct interpretation of the Establishment Clause is that Congress can't make any law respecting religion, so it can't even touch that. It demands total separation. I think it makes sense. The central theme behind the court's reasoning in all of these cases is the need to protect students from coercion. The court recognized that schools put students in a vulnerable position. For one thing, students are kids. They're young. Their little squishy brains haven't solidified yet. I'm not a neuroscientist. If I could do STEM, I wouldn't have gone to law school. Their youth makes them more vulnerable to caving under pressure, especially when it comes to sort of ideological and cerebral things like religion. The second thing that the court goes back to again and again to support its rulings is that schools are highly social environments, and social transgression is punished more harshly than it is in most adult environments. 99 times out of 100, probably more than that actually, when a school tries to institute a religion, it's Christianity. Christianity already has a disproportionate amount of social power because it's the majority religion. So opting out of class prayers means alienating yourself from your peers who wield a significant amount of social power over you, and rebelling against your teacher who wields a significant amount of institutional power against you. Students don't have a meaningful choice when the threat of exclusion or retaliation is so overwhelming. However, the fact that young students are vulnerable to coercion in school is exactly why fundamentalists want to get prayer in school. Fundamentalist churches are tuned to what they call the 4 to 14 window. Evangelical churches surveyed a group of Christians and found that they first reported coming to know and believe in thy Lord when they were between the ages of 4 and 14. This led some fundamentalist groups to, arguably spuriously, refer to this age range
as a key time frame of opportunities for churches to introduce a solid Christian foundation in the lives of their children that is more likely to have a lasting impact.
For the record, although I think that kids are really vulnerable to coercion at that age, I don't think that 4 to 14 statistic is really meaningful. It mostly indicates that kids with Christian parents who bring them to church when they're babies are more likely than other people to be Christians, which Yeah. Although even if kids weren't vulnerable at all to any kind of social coercion or conversion at that age, I would still have a problem with prayer in public schools because it tends to be extremely divisive. It creates conflicts and it tends to leave communities fractured along religious lines. Although the divisiveness is also kind of part of the intended outcome. To evangelize most successfully, a lot of fundamentalists believe that they need to scare people by revealing how harsh and cruel the world is for people who aren't saved. I find the fundamentalist moral framework pretty tragic. It manipulates people into cruelty not by taking advantage of some kind of hidden inner core of sadism within them, but rather by making cruelty feel kind. It sort of reminds me of how some parents will disown their queer kids because they believe that queerness will inevitably and intractably lead their child into a life of suffering. So, in their mind, if they were to act supporting of their kid, they would be an accomplice in their child's miserable life. Therefore, throwing their kid out on the street is kind of a form of accelerationism. The hope is that if they can make their kid realize how horrible a life of being queer really is, as soon as possible, they can get their kid to return to the heterosexual fold before it's too late. The same basic dynamic is at play with the Christian right's attempts to desecularize public schools. The fact that introducing prayer is contentious and divisive is desirable. Many Christian nationalists believe that schools unjustly dethroned churches as the center of community life for families. So if a public school has a really great community, ruining that community is actually sort of an act of kindness. Even though it might hurt people's feelings in the short term, it's at least trying to prevent their kids from going to hell in the long term. Okay, this is too dark. Have we all basked in the UV light spectacle? Take a sip of that, and I'm going to turn on another light. Anyway, Christian nationalist philosophers have been carrying the school sucks torch for centuries, but it only became a really mainline political fundamentalist thing after the 80s, which meant that by the time that suburban evangelical moms were getting wet for firebombing schools or whatever, their beliefs were going against the overwhelming legal current. In order to introduce God into the classroom, they would need to step on the prior legal precedent's throat, milk out all the secularism, and then only then would it be ready to be pumped full of thy seed of thy Lord. Which takes us all the way back to the federal courts. To get a turnaround that significant, they would need to dominate the Supreme Court, which they did not at the time. But remember, to get appointed as a federal judge or justice, all you need is the right connection, which is fertile ground for exploitation. In 1991, Leonard Leo, a law student at Cornell, an outspoken fascist, and a man who's kind of bafflingly incapable of having his picture taken, he gave up on democracy. In his eyes, the election of Bill Clinton and the lukewarm neoliberalism that his administration represented was kind of the killing blow to any chance that he had of democratically elected fascism in America. It's pretty easy for fundamentalists to teach kids how to repress their feelings and desires by soaking them in shame, but it's a lot harder to convince adults who have already experienced lives of freedom to stuff themselves back into lives of perdicitude. Any candidate whose platform boiled down to less fun, more solemn prayer didn't have a super great chance in the polls. So if a Democratic victory was not an option, what was Leonard Leo to do? Was he supposed to just sit by and watch people live satisfying lives with well-fitting suits? Rather, he devoted his career to the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is a conservative legal group. Their whole thing is acting as a pipeline between conservative law students and the federal judiciary. Their technique is super simple. They found student groups at law schools, which are always called societies, because I guess clubs is a name best left to the pox-ridden masses. Then the Federalist Society's chapters will have judicial meet and greets and networking events and backyard barbecues and any kind of social event with the same racist, masculine bravado of a cross burning, except with less manual labor. Like 90% of getting a job in law is about who you know. This is particularly true for federal judges. You can have the most impressive qualifications in the world, but if you don't know the right people, you have zero chance of getting a federal appointment. Unfortunately, the reverse is true. So people with no qualifications, but with all the right social connections, they can get appointed to the federal bench. Considering that the first Federalist Society chapters were at Harvard, Yale, and the University of Chicago, they had all of the right social connections to form an effective pipeline. And I don't want to spoil this here, but the Federalist Society's tactic was really successful. Now, well over 90% of conservative federal judges and 100% of conservative Supreme Court justices are Federalist Society members. The federal courts are now rigged in favor of fundamentalist litigants. And as evil as the Federalist Society is, they are an inevitable byproduct of a system in which power begets power. But just having courts filled with conservative judges is not enough to advance the law in favor of Christian nationalism. The Supreme Court reverses prior rulings by way of new cases. As we talked about earlier, out of about 500,000 federal court cases every year, 70 make it to the Supreme Court. So my strategy, going back into my official Phyllis Schlafly character, slayer of women's libers, my strategy is, first, we find churchies who are aggrieved. People who have, in some way, shape, or form, tried to introduce prayer into schools and were rebuked or reprimanded for their efforts. We find those aggrieved, fanatical lunatics and connect them with pro bono legal representation. In addition to seeking out promising lawsuits, we make our own lawsuits. That means funding and supporting quasi-constitutional legislation about religion in public schools. If we get any of that legislation passed, somebody is bound to challenge it in court, and then we can use that as our ticket to the Supreme Court. This process of eroding the former legal precedent by inundating the federal courts with fundamentalist-oriented impact litigation will start out slow at first. But the more time goes by, the more Supreme Court justices will die or retire. That means more chances at appointing a Federalist Society member into their spot. The more fundamentalist judges we can appoint, the more extreme and drastic their rulings will get, and the more drastic their court rulings get, the more extreme our lawsuits can be. So, starting at the beginning, let's track how this strategy actually evolved in the real world. I think the best starting point to look at is 2001's Good News Club versus Milford Central School District. I guess you could say I'm putting the MILF in Milford Central School District. I'm going to be talking about this case in some depth. For one thing, it introduces a lot of themes that we're going to see the court come back to in later lawsuits. It's also a good example of how introducing sectarianism into public schools ends up hurting basically everybody involved, including the religious people. The Good News Club is an evangelical organization whose whole thing is converting our nation's youths to Christ. The group is structured like a multi-level marketing company. So the Good News Club itself trains teachers who are club leaders, and then those teachers go to their community and set up clubs, and those clubs recruit students who then try to convert other students. These club meetings take place after school in public school classrooms. However, it's not formally affiliated with the school. This setup isn't uncommon at all. Think of the Girl Scouts. They tend to meet after school in a classroom or the gym or whatever. However, they're still not formally part of the public school. Obviously, for a religious club, it not being formally affiliated with the public school is really important. However, the Good News Club's entire thing is tricking students into falsely believing that the club is part of their school. They do so using pretty sneaky tactics. For example, club leaders will start a meeting in a classroom while there's still like 10 or 15 minutes left in class, which makes it seem like the club is part of the class itself. They also do things like hanging up posters next to official school posters at like child eye height. so that it's kind of indistinguishable which ones are club-related posters and which ones are school-related posters. Arguably, the worst tactic that they would use is the MLM. The adult club leaders, as representatives of an official religious organization, are pretty keenly aware of what they can and can't do. They can hold meetings in the schools if the schools let them, and they can't tell a Jewish student that they are going to hell. However, other students can say that to their peers. So club leaders would instruct evangelical students who were already club members to try to convert their peers by saying awful things to them, telling them that they're going to hell, telling them that their families are doomed to suffer eternally. Unsurprisingly, this tactic had a pretty devastating impact on everyone who was involved. For one thing, non-Christian students were subjected to discriminatory bullying, and Christian students who joined the Good News Club alienated themselves from their peers. Parents of club members report having their kids come home crying because they're heartbroken because they lost a valued friendship based on something that a Good News Club leader told them to say. As it turns out, the post-World War II Supreme Court was very correct to fear the coercive impact that introducing religion into public schools could have. In 2001, the Milford Central School Districts in Ohio refused to let the Good News Club hold meetings at one of its schools. And in retaliation, the Good News Club sued, and their suit managed to reach the Supreme Court. That was 2001. The Federalist Society had been around for a little while. They had 2 members on the Supreme Court, so, enough to have sway, but not enough to really do the shit they're doing now. Unfortunately, Clarence Thomas wrote the opinion for the majority. He sided with the Good News Club, explaining that by banning them from holding meetings after school, Milford Central School District was violating not their right to establish or practice their religion, but rather their right to free expression. I can hear you right now spitting out your ball gag and saying, but Mistress Schlafly, I thought we were talking about the religion parts of the First Amendment. Where did all of this free speech bullshit come from? You're absolutely right. Where did all of this free speech bullshit come from? Did you see that? It's incredible. Well, I guess it wasn't that incredible. By the way, don't mind the exposed nest wiring right there. I am pretty sure that the Holy Ghost in the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is referring to the Nest algorithm that's probably selling my data to the cops. Anyway, let's look back at the First Amendment.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Like everything in the Constitution, it's kind of a run-on sentence, and it has a lot of clauses in it, which are basically a mini sentence inside of a bigger sentence, usually separated by commas or, God forbid, semicolons. Every clause in the First Amendment is naming a different right. The clause that ended up mattering here is the Free Expression Clause.
Or abridging the freedom of speech.
The first 2 are the ones that deal with religion. We've got the Establishment Clause.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion,
which lets you establish the church of sucking dick and cock. And then the Free Exercise Clause.
Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
which lets you worship at the altar of sucking dick and cock. The clause that matters here is neither of those first 2. It's the Free Expression Clause, which is the one that talks about speech just in general.
Or abridging the freedom of speech.
That's what most people refer to when they talk about free speech. So it's odd that the court in this case ruled based off of not any of the religious clauses, but free speech in general, even though this is specifically a case where the Establishment Clause is kind of the thing at issue. The glaring problem with their approach of saying that Milford violated Good News Club's free expression is that schools can and do prohibit political organizations from meeting after school all the time. That's completely normal, and the court doesn't see a problem with that. The court doesn't impinge on the school's right to, say, prevent the anarchist, Maoist, Republican Investment Club from meeting in the gymnasium after school. That's completely okay. It only wants to protect free speech when it's Christian speech. Oh no. If you think that seems confusing, that's because it doesn't make that much sense. Clarence Thomas effectively created a super category of protected speech. In the words of the dissent,
if a school decides to authorize after-school discussions of current events in its classrooms, it may not exclude people from expressing their views simply because it dislikes their particular political opinions. But must it therefore allow organized political groups, for example, the Democratic Party, the Libertarian Party, or the Ku Klux Klan, to hold meetings, the principal purpose of which is not to discuss the current events topic from their own unique point of view, but rather to recruit others to join their respective groups? I think not.
Anyway, that's Good News Club versus Milford. The outcome of this case became the new legal standard moving forward. That's how precedent works. Think of this as phase 1 of religious public schools. Oh, god damn it. I'm never gonna get used to that. It's good to not touch your face in general, but that's like when you're out in public. I'm gonna touch my... I was touching my face as I was talking about how I can't touch my face. That's great. In phase 1, they can't officially hold school prayers, nor can religious schools directly get money from public school funds. Yet, that brings us to phase 2. Here, we're gonna see a familiar face. Betsy DeVos was born Elizabeth Hollywood Prince. I don't know about what her middle name is, actually. Her father was a hardcore evangelical Calvinist and also a billionaire. Also, her brother is the founder of Blackwater and responsible for a handful of massacres. Anyway, Betsy Prince married Dick DeVos, whose dad founded the multi-level marketing titan, Amway. These people are just soaking wet for abusive power hierarchies, aren't they? In addition to being billionaires, Betsy and Dick were united in matrimony over their shared interest in being hardcore fundamentalists. They also share a long-standing hatred for public schools. In 2000, the DeVos family took their first crack at destabilizing secular public schools in Michigan by pouring money into Michigan's Kids First, Yes, which was a campaign to amend Michigan's state constitution to allow private religious academies to get public school funding. Despite the catchy and comprehensible and perfectly not baffling name, Kids First, Yes, was a complete failure in the polls. Oops. This loss taught the DeVos family a very important lesson. Electoral politics are for socialists and poor people. Rather than debasing themselves in the swill of democratic elections, the DeVos family could advance their political agenda by using their massive wealth to fund legislation and legal campaigns. Specifically, they focused on voucher programs. Voucher programs are essentially constitutional money laundering. The government isn't allowed to directly fund religious schools because that would violate the Establishment Clause. The voucher programs are essentially an end run around that constitutional prohibition. What they do is give students a voucher that represents a year's worth of public school tuition. The students then have a choice to either spend that on public schools or spend it to cover the cost of a year's worth of private school. And it just so happens that in pretty much every state, especially states that have enacted voucher programs, interestingly, the vast majority of private schools are religious. So rather than having state money go directly to fund religious educations, state money goes to the vouchers, which goes to the students, who then give it to the religious schools, and then the religious schools redeem it to get state money. This logical cul-de-sac reached the Supreme Court 1 year after the ruling in Milford. The case was called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris. The trouble started in Cleveland, Ohio. In the 50s, Cleveland was hit very hard by white flight. Despite its ever-shrinking white population, Cleveland's public schools resisted desegregation very fiercely. So much so that in the 70s, federal courts had to persistently oversee a busing program to integrate the schools. Even though busing made schools less segregated, Cleveland itself was still highly segregated. Economic racism, in addition to industrial decline, meant that by 1994, Cleveland was the United States' poorest city, and I believe it still is today. Cleveland funded its public schools with taxes, and by the 90s, its tax income was just not enough to fund an adequate education. As a result, Cleveland Public Schools' graduation rate went from 75% in 1976 to 25% in 1996. That's what led to Cleveland's voucher programs. At first glance, voucher programs might make a little bit of sense. If public schools are failing to give students a decent education, then getting them out of public schools and into adequate private schools seems like a solution. But if you think about it for more than a few seconds, you're going to realize that this program mostly just strips money out of an already financially destitute public school system. Which is why, no, tuition vouchers were not a good solution to this problem. But they are a solution that starts to make a grotesque kind of sense when you look at the demographics of Cleveland's private schools. About 90% of participating private schools in Cleveland were Christian, the vast majority of which were Catholic. However, only about 1% of Cleveland's black population were Catholic. These school vouchers were just a way to evacuate white students from a desperately underfunded school system while leaving black students to rot. Christian nationalists first entered the political arena with their ultimate goal being to reinstate school segregation, and in this case, that is exactly what they did. Ohio citizens rightfully sued to challenge the constitutionality of this legislation. They claimed that the voucher program was only superficially secular, given the fact that well over 90% of these schools were Christian. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court was not willing to scrutinize this program beyond its secular patina, nor was it willing to stop Ohio from using desperately needed government funds to fund religious education. Remember, prior to this case, the Supreme Court interpreted the Establishment Clause to mean that the state could not intervene to support any kind of religious education at all. In supporting this voucher program, the Supreme Court completely overturned this interpretation. Instead, they said that it's okay for states to financially support religious schools, as long as it's doing so as part of a technically neutral program with respect to religion. Voucher programs are just giving students the choice to get their education wherever they please. And if they choose to get their education at a religious school, so be it. So in that sense, it technically satisfies a certain interpretation of the Establishment Clause. That was in 2002. At the time, the court did lean a little conservative, and the conservative end was definitely starting to veer into the ultra-conservative. However, there was still the threat of a swing vote to keep things somewhat balanced. During the Bush administration, 2 Supreme Court justices died. Retired into the grave. William Rehnquist, who was quite conservative and also thought that homosexuality was contagious like measles. We should have told those QAnon people that that's what the vaccine was for. And also Sandra Day O'Connor, who was moderately conservative through most of her career, although she was definitely leaning a little bit more toward centrist by the end. Rehnquist was replaced with John Roberts, who's pretty conservative, but not puritanical colonial New England conservative. And O'Connor was replaced by Samuel Alito, who is completely deranged, and also his voice sounds unsettlingly similar to Christian Slater and Heathers. So during the Bush years, the overall balance of the court didn't change that much, but the conservative ends got a lot more conservative. A similar thing happened during Obama's administration, but reversed. 2 liberal justices died or retired and were replaced by 2 more liberal justices. So again, the balance was pretty similar, but the 2 ends of the political spectrum were polarizing. Then, on February 13th of 2016, hardline conservative and Federalist Society founder, Justice Antonin Scalia, died unexpectedly on a, frankly, kind of gay-sounding hunting trip. Scalia was a judge who would yell about hating gays and bisexuals as well. Then he suddenly died in bed with a guy, and now he is burning in hell. Anyway, Obama still had a year left in office, and so it was his right to appoint a new justice. But for the first time in U.S. history, the Senate just refused to vote on it. It's not that they refused to vote to confirm one of Obama's nominees, it's that they just would not hold a vote. Their plan was to just wait it out. They just wanted to wait until Obama was out of office and then have his hopefully conservative successor appoint the justice. And unfortunately, their plan, it worked. Obama left office with the shaped hole that Scalia left still vacant. Then Trump was elected and he summarily appointed Neil Gorsuch, who, just by the way he smiles, I feel like he had braces at some point. He doesn't anymore, but I think he did. and kind of that like memory of having braces never fully left him. Actually, you know what I look like? I look like a white math teacher who's like haplessly trying to engage his youthful students who liked Hamilton. Then the centrist justice and the court's swingiest swing vote, Anthony Kennedy, retired, and he was replaced by Brett Kavanaugh. That the balance of the court pretty bad. And then the court's long-standing liberal judge, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died, and she was replaced by Amy Coney Barrett, who's basically just if Margaret White from Carrie flat-ironed her hair. We have 6 conservative justices, and every single one of them is a member of the Federalist Society, and every single one of them is intellectually dishonest, and also pretty hardline and fundamentalist. Basically, the Federalist Society strategy finally paid off. And for opponents of secular public schools, it started bearing fruit in 2020 with Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. Isn't that right? It is! In this case, Montana's constitution had an amendment that said that the state could not provide any kind of financial aid to any religious school. The Supreme Court ruled that this amendment was unconstitutional. So back in 2002 with Zellman, the court said that states could fund private religious educations if they wanted, and now they're saying that states must. The majority breathlessly reaffirms parents' right to give kids private religious educations, but some of the most notable content in this case happens in the concurrences. In a court case, the majority opinion is the one that's binding law, and concurrences are when justices vote for the majority, and they also want to make a point separately. So concurrences are not binding law, but they are important looks into the goals and intentions and philosophies of the justices that voted with the majority. Samuel Alito's concurrence is basically just an extensive retelling about how Montana has a prodigious anti-Catholic bias historically in its public schools. He ends by insisting that the term sectarian is actually a microaggression against Catholics. The idea of Christian oppression is a pretty prominent feature in Christian nationalism, and that's definitely at play here. However, I would say that the Alito concurrence is mostly remarkable because of its strangeness. Meanwhile, Justice Thomas's concurrence just bought a PureFlix subscription and a QAnon t-shirt. For the record, yes, Justice Thomas's wife is Ginny Thomas, the January 6th lady. So, he claims that the Establishment Clause was only ever meant to apply to the federal government, meaning that state governments can establish religion. In fact, he says that state governments can claim a single state-sanctioned religion. To support his claim, he cites mixed historical evidence, and I had never heard of this evidence before, and so I clicked his little footnote link, and it linked me to a case from the 2000s, specifically his dissent in that case, where he claims that there's mixed historical evidence. Academia. He's like, how can I be acting in bad faith if I want everyone to be Christian? That's good faith. Anyway, I guess that brings us back to June of this year. This June was really bad for anyone who lives in this country. Overturn Roe v. Wade. They ruled in a case where there's overwhelming, incontrovertible evidence that a man on death row was innocent, and the court ruled that his innocence was not enough to overturn his conviction. So, yeah, not great, but we're focusing on religion in schools right now. In addition to all their other rulings, we got a ruling in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. This case is about Coach Joseph Kennedy, who looks like what would happen if you put Bart Simpson through one of those aging algorithms that they use for the pictures of missing children who have been gone for several decades. Coach Kennedy was a football coach, And before every game, he would hold a prayer in the locker room. Immediately after every game, he would kneel down on the 50-yard line, loudly hold a prayer that kind of doubled as a prayer and also like an inspirational speech for his team. When the school district learned of this, they were like, hey, it sort of seems like you're coercing students to take part in prayer as part of your official capacity as their coach. Could you just wait like a little bit after the game till people have left, or at least have a chance to leave to pray on the 50-yard line? Or if you don't want to wait, will you just like go to a different room? Can you just do it somewhere other than the 50-yard line? Like you're the center of attention. You're speaking loudly to all these people at the center of attention right after the game has ended, and they don't even have time to like stand up for the bleachers yet, okay? Can you do one of those things? In response, Coach Kennedy hired a far-right team of lawyers and reached out to pretty much every media outlet who could contact and said, everybody, quickly, look over here. I am being oppressed. Look at my Christian oppression. And he also did like a lot of photo shoots of him kneeling. The crunch of grass meeting his crunchy knees populates this menagerie of photos with crunchy sound. In his many media interviews, he insisted that he wasn't asking anyone to pray with him. This was a lie. He did reach out. He approached other teams asking them to pray with him.
In September 2015, a coach from another school's football team informed BHS's principal that Kennedy had asked him and his team to join Kennedy in prayer. Kennedy had acknowledged inviting others to join him on many previous occasions.
He also said that there was no coercion in his team praying with him because they had every right to leave if they wanted. However, a number of players on his team had already affirmatively reached out to the school district to complain that they did not feel like they had a meaningful choice to not pray. They said that they didn't want to pray with him, but they felt like they had to because if they didn't, they would be undermining their team's cohesion and they also would be socially excluded. He also said that his prayer wasn't causing any harm to the school's community, even though his incendiary media interviews were very divisive.
In the wake of this media coverage, the district began receiving a large number of emails, letters, and calls, many of them threatening.
And also, he had caused literal harm because when he kneeled on the 50-yard line following one of his games, there was a literal stampede and it injured several students. However, in all fairness, I do personally appreciate his media presence because it really validated my choice not to get hair plugs. He was like, maybe if my hairline's completely straight, I'll stop having all those lustful dreams about Tom Landry. Anyway, after he had whipped up all this media frenzy and then refused to take any of the alternative prayer locations or times that the school offered and kept praying at the 50-yard line while refusing to change any of his behavior, the school district put him on paid administrative leave. At the end of his year-long contract, he chose not to renew it. And then he sued them. He wanted recompense for his horrifying Christian oppression. Those facts are pretty bad. Like, the school literally gave him a reasonable alternative to his attention-hungry, goddamn 50-yard line squatting, and he refused.
The district recounted that it had offered accommodations to and offered to engage in further discussions with Kennedy to permit his religious exercise, and that Kennedy had failed to respond to these offers. Instead, his attorneys told the media that he would accept only demonstrative prayer on the 50-yard line immediately after games.
And also all the media interviews, I mean, it looks desperate and kind of pathetic in my opinion, but also it does not look very good for his case that his prayer was like a personal connection with God.
The court noted that he had in fact refused, quote, an accommodation permitting him to pray after the stadium had emptied, indicating that it is essential that his speech be delivered in the presence of students and spectators.
So, how did the court justify siding with him? Well, they just lied. Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority, just made up better sounding facts and replaced the actual facts of the case with his Coach Kennedy fan fiction. In the court's version, Coach Kennedy was actually happy to either wait a little bit after the game or, I don't know, pray somewhere a little less conspicuous. He actually approached the school district looking for a less contentious alternative.
Mr. Kennedy emphasized that he sought only the opportunity to, quote, wait until the game is over and the players have left the field, and then walk midfield to say a short, private, personal prayer.
Also, his prayer wasn't a motivational Christian speech that football coach yelled to his entire team at the 50-yard line. Instead, the court harps on and on about how it was like a quiet, murmured little personal affirmation of his individual faith. Then the court uses this completely made-up version of how things happened as the basis to support their claim that Coach Kennedy was not acting in his official capacity as a coach, even though it was right after the game. People were still in the bleachers, everyone was still on the field, and he was on, again, the 50-yard line, the most conspicuous place he could possibly find. No, he was expressing his personal relationship with thy Lord as a private citizen. Also, it was not causing any contention. He didn't want attention for it. It wasn't harming anyone. That stampede, it just didn't happen. This opinion is unusual in that it communicates that even if you violate the Constitution in a way that creates very unfavorable facts for your case, the court is willing to just lie to erase all those annoying little problems. Remember how at the beginning of this, it was like small incremental steps pushing the Constitution in the direction they wanted it? Well, that kind of restraint, it's no longer necessary. It's been just over a month since this case was handed down, and we are already seeing that fundamentalist litigants and school officials have gotten the message. For example, the Miami-Dade School Board just approved an official day of prayer. Schools across the entire country are planning to do prayer days. They're planning to hold official prayer in school and celebrate the start of this school year by holding an official welcome back to school prayer, which sounds like two forms of torture to me. Boredom in anticipation for more boredom of a different kind. How fun. Arizona lawmakers just announced a bill that would institute universal vouchers for all of its students. This would effectively kill public schools in Arizona. No surprise, 75% of private schools in that state are religious. So what can we do? What is there to be done? Because this situation feels pretty dire. Well, I've criticized the judiciary for being authoritarian a lot during this video, but I do want to make it clear that I don't really support democratically elected judges. There are some states who already do that, and their track record has shown that democratically elected judges tend to be extremely hawkish on crime, to the degree that they stop caring about whether a defendant is actually guilty. Fortunately, there are pretty clear and simple solutions here. One, pack the court. The Constitution explicitly allows Congress to add new seats to the court. 9 is a completely arbitrary number. It used to be 6, I think. There's literally no reason why we can't add more. I don't care how many more. We could add 50 more and have them all yell over each other like Parliament. That's only something that Congress can do. Biden can't do it. It can't be done through executive order. Congress has to vote to pack the court. Additionally, and this is also in Congress's power, we need term limits for federal judges and Supreme Court justices. Nobody is entitled to a lifetime of unfettered access to power. Term limits and packing the court would arrest this far-right scheme to co-opt our judicial and legal system. We can stop this right here, which means that I'm sorry. I know that nobody wants to hear this anymore, especially after all this time of Biden's impotent leadership. But you need to vote. I know that it's hard to support Democrats right now because they have not accomplished really anything despite having the House, the Senate, and the presidency. But there is a very concrete reason why they have been unable to achieve any of their legislative goals. Manchin and Sinema, two corrupt Democratic senators, are standing in the way of all this progress. They're able to do so because although we do have the majority of the Senate, we have a very narrow majority. So no matter how much political will there is among every single other Democratic congressperson or senator, Sinema or Manchin can stop anything dead in its tracks, and they have. I see people blaming Biden for this, and I don't even like Biden. I don't want to defend him, but you're making me defend him because there's nothing that the executive branch can do do about the judiciary. This is only something that Congress can do. And the only way to stop people like Sinema and Manchin from having so much power is to have more senators. If we didn't have such a narrow majority in the Senate, those two would be irrelevant. They would have no power. Nobody would give a shit whether or not they voted for a climate bill. But simply not voting is not a form of protest against the system. It's just complicity in the rising tide of fascism. And I know that for most people watching, voting for a Democrat is going to feel like a compromise, because it is a compromise, and that sucks. That sucks. But if you're dedicated to fighting against fascism until doing so requires making a compromise or voting for someone who isn't ideal, then you don't give a about fighting fascism. You just care about the aesthetics of being a revolutionary. I cannot stress the importance of not losing to the Republicans in these upcoming elections. I earnestly believe that we are at a tipping point. And if Republicans get any control back, they will voting rights so badly that any semblance of democracy that we have left is gone. So please, I beg of you, please vote. Please vote. Oh God. Alright, thank you all for watching. I'm gonna let out my dog. He hates glow-in-the-dark paint, and he also hates it when I wear a wig. Oh, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna put a little bit of glow-in-the-dark paint on my face real fast. Here we go. I'm gonna make like an eye here and here. Charge it up. Charge it on up.